Hello, my name is Jillian Browning, and I'm on the organizational board for the Comics and Popular Arts Conference. The Comics and Popular Arts Conference is a peer-reviewed academic conference that takes place within DragonCon every year. So how it works is that you present papers to us, they are peer-reviewed, and then you can be on a panel just like this. We are coming at you a little bit differently this year from home digitally, but we do hope to give you the same amount of fun and informal and academic content as we normally do. So if you would like to find any more information about the Comics and Popular Arts Conference, you can go to our website and our Twitter or our Facebook, and you can go ahead and we can have discussions on there. You can see other things within other tracks that are going to be happening. Today, Melanie Waddell will be presenting on Making a Villain, Gaston Was Framed, and I present to you, Melanie.
Hi, my name is Melanie Waddell, and I'm from Convix Cosplay. This is titled Making a Villain, subtitle Gaston Was Framed. It's basically going to go through visual coding in Disney animated films and talk about how we know who the villain is, how Disney codes those people as the villain, and why I don't think Gaston is one. So first things first, I just want to say I'm not a Gaston apologist. He is an extremely problematic character. However, I do think he's gotten a bad rap as far as being the villain of this story, and so that's what I'm going to talk about today. These are just some definitions to sort of make sure we're all on the same base. I'll be using some of these words later on, and I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. So just to give a brief outline of where this presentation will go, first I'm going to talk about what a villain is. So general characteristics, some examples of traditional villains, and then I'm going to specifically look at a comparison between the 1991 animated Beauty and the Beast and the 2017 live action Beauty and the Beast. And we're going to focus on the character of Gaston. So talking a little bit about who he is, why he's considered a villain, if he's a villain. Spoilers, I don't think so. We're going to talk about some side notes that provide context to the decisions and the writing behind this character, and then I'm going to finally end with my argument of who the true villain is. Hopefully by the time we're finished, I will have convinced you that Gaston is a problematic character, but not the overarching villain of this story. We have some stills from the 1991 animated version of Beauty and the Beast. For the purposes of comparison, we're going to focus on a few main characters, those being the Beast, who is a young boy or man, cursed for approximately 10 to 20 years, depending on the interpretation, as a lesson in responsibility, neighborliness, and love. We have Belle, a young woman who likes to read, is intellectual. Gaston, our alleged villain. LeFou, who is Gaston's best friend and follower, Maurice, which is Belle's father, an eccentric inventor/artist, depending on the interpretation. We have the villagers, who are described as provincial people, and then we have two versions of the enchantress, one in her old lady form, and then one in her true form. So already, just by looking at these images, we can see some common themes. We can see that Maurice and the villagers are much more muted than our main characters up here. We can also see that the enchantress favors green. It seems to be a color scheme among her outfits. We can see that LeFou and Gaston both wear red, and that Beast and Belle have on blue. So just by looking at these frames, we can see already a number of different things, telling us that Gaston and LeFou are probably connected, that Beast and Belle are probably connected, that Maurice is probably not going to have as much of an impact, and that the Enchantress does maintain some consistency even among her different forms. So looking at the 2017 version of the film, these are either actual frames or movie posters, in any event the representation of these characters in the movie. And we can see some similar sort of themes going on. The Enchantress doesn't have the same color scheme. She's obviously much different in this interpretation than she is in the 91 version, but we do see Belle maintaining that white and blue with the underdress and then her overdress. We see Maurice maintaining somewhat of a muted color scheme, but he does have on blue tying him to Belle. We also see Beast in blue quite a bit, and then Gaston and LeFou having these accents of red, or for Gaston, that being his main color. So specifically for looking at Gaston, we're going to use the 1991 film and the 2017 film. But for looking at villains in general and for different princesses, I've chosen to use those ones that precede Gaston. So it is important to note that Gaston as a character did not exist prior to the 1991 film. The original story that Beauty and the Beast is based on did not include him as a character, but did have ideas of rejected suitors that we see introduced in interpretations as early as 1942 with the film La Belle et la Bête. The original screenplays for Disney's interpretation, though, were included of several suitors who were then condensed into this character of Gaston. So some of that over-exaggeration comes from him being a literal caricature of several different suitors and all of their worst tendencies and characteristics. So when talking about Gaston as a villain and whether he qualifies as one thing we have to do is first describe a foundation of what villains are. So this is general sort of foundational understanding of typical or traditional Disney villain qualities, and I will go through them with some examples provided by our lovely evil queen, Ursula, Lady Tremaine, as our female representations, and then our male representations who are not pre-1991, but are close or at least provide evidence of some of the characteristics, so they're visually useful. But those are Jafar, Dr. Facilier, and then Claude Frollo from Hunchback of Notre Dame. So the first characteristic is that Disney villains tend to embody one or more of the 7 deadly sins. So I've taken the liberty of identifying some of these. You could make the claim that they're different. For example, I've seen some arguments that Ursula embodies all of them. I think these probably most accurately reflect their supposed sins, and it's easy to see in some of their cases, right? For Frollo, we have lust and pride. I don't think anyone could argue against those, really. For Lady Tremaine, we have pride, and to a lesser extent, sloth. For Dr. Facilier, we have, to a lesser extent, sloth, but also greed. Ursula's the whole bevy of sins. Jafar, we also have lust and pride. And then for Evil Queen, pride, and her big one, of course, is envy. So I think that it's easy to see how these characters embody these, but that could be said for a lot of different characters. So we'll talk about Gaston a little bit later, but there are arguments to be made that, Belle, for example, from Beauty and the Beast, embodies the sin of pride. She's very stuck up in the beginning. She sings a song about the villagers. So this one's more of a general rule of thumb, but it is important to note. They also tend to have very specific color schemes. So we can see here that there's a lot of purple, a lot of black, with the purple here in, Frollo's hat, Lady Tremaine's collar, all of Ursula that she's got going on over here. We have some stuff for Dr. Facilier, and we even see this in the older films where the purple eyeshadow and this indigo type color to Evil Queen's dress. We also see black a lot. Obviously, Evil Queen's frock. Jafar's outfit has a lot of black. Ursula's entire dress is black, or I guess dress tentacles, that mixture is black. Dr. Facilier's hat is black, and then Claude Frollo's robes are black as well. We also see green a lot. We can see it spectacularly here with Lady Tremaine's eyes, but you can think of Maleficent as an example where green comes into play. Villains tend to have henchmen or sidekicks who do their bidding, and they usually have very explicitly evil motivations. They want power or youth or wealth. They also have a very specific vocabulary. They use fool a lot, which I think is kind of funny. This is just a small example of how many times fool is used for all of these different villains, and Gaston does not use it, by the way, interestingly enough. We'll talk more about that later, but just so you know, that's coming. In terms of being visually distinct, here we can see, starting with the Evil Queen, she's a female character, so based on the representations in that film of femaleness, we would expect her to be similar to Snow White. They have a lot of qualities in common, almost two sides of the same coin, with the Evil Queen being jealous of Snow White's beauty that she once possessed. But we don't see the similarities in terms of their visualization. Snow White is dainty and small. The Evil Queen has a square jawline. She has very broad shoulders. She's a much larger character, not necessarily in terms of being massive against Snow White, but the proportions of her body are enlarged. We can see that she has a little bit more of a masculine appearance, despite all of the makeup. It's almost as if the makeup is trying to cover up the masculine characteristics that she has. We can also see here with Jafar, he has a very thin face. He has very exaggerated features. We can see this with Ursula, which is a little bit different because she is based on a real-life drag queen. But however, she is presented in the film as female, and so she has this very large jaw and very enlarged body. On the opposite side of that, we have Dr. Facilier, who has a very thin frame. He's very petite in his waist proportions, for example, and his face is very thin. So we can see, even with Lady Tremaine, who is a female character, she has a smaller body. It's not as oversized as Ursula's or as broad-shouldered as the Evil Queen's, but her face still has this very long, drawn appearance. And so she does have over-exaggerated outfits as well, which emphasize her shoulders and her taking up physical space. And so the females are presented as villains, but they have masculine characteristics, and then the male villains have feminine characteristics in terms of their body structure and their facial frames, that kind of stuff. Another way we see visually distinct characters is in skin tones. So just in this alone, you can see how the skin is grayer. It embodies that shadow a lot more than, for example, our protagonist. You think back to the Belle picture from a bit ago, she was much lighter portrayed than these characters are. We can also see eye color. Disney villains typically have very specific eye colors of black, brown, green, and to a lesser extent purple. Most of the time, your Disney villains are going to have brown or green eyes, just statistically. The next category is makeup, or the visual appearance of makeup. So switching back over to my pointer, we can obviously see the Evil Queen has on a lot of makeup, right? And that's over-exaggerating her features. She's got red lips, rouge, eyeliner, eyeshadow, penciled on eyebrows. But it's not just the female characters who have makeup. So whether or not Jafar is actually wearing eyeshadow here, his eyes are darker, giving the appearance of eyeshadow. So where we have, these representations of females wearing lots and lots of makeup, we also have males who have these same characteristics. So you can see here, just with the eyes, for example, obviously Evil Queen has eyeshadow on, but Jafar's eyes are darker as well, giving the appearance of eyeshadow. Ursula has eyeshadow on, and Dr. Facilier, his eyes are dark as well, specifically in a way that looks to be eyeshadow. Lady Tremaine is a slightly more subtle look, but she also has the overarched eyebrows, the eyeshadow, and the lips, which are a variation of red. And then Claudfrodo, who is also a more subtle example of our male, he still has the very similar facial structure, and he also has the exaggerated eyebrows. He has the dark, you can kind of see it here, the darkness of the eyes. It's slightly more subtle, but even his lips have the appearance of like a dark wine-colored lipstick. And so it's slightly more subtle than the over-exaggeration of the body shape, either being extremely thin, like for Dr. Facilier here, or large, like for Ursula, but it is still something that is a general theme among Disney characters. And we also see that the male villains usually either have long hair or they're wearing a hat. And then our female villains tend to have short hair, or it's put up to give the appearance of short hair. So we can see here that we have no idea what Evil Queen's hair looks like from this picture. It is under her dress, but we can see with Ursula she has short hair, and then Lady Tremaine's hair is pulled up, and so it does give the appearance of being short. And I know that some of you might be thinking, oh, you know, there's differences between old school Disney villains and new school Disney villains, and there might be. We'll talk about that in a second as well. Another general characteristic is they tend to be older than the protagonist, and that they embody this idea of the other. So specifically, when you're looking at all of these villains together, you can see common themes, right? Like the colors or the face shapes, but it's really striking when you watch them in their own movies against people who are quote unquote normal, or, you know, our protagonist, our hero, or even just the regular everyday folk like the villagers in the Beauty and the Beast. So here is an example of a newer Disney villain. Not Disney villain specifically, but a newer Disney film. And here we have Kristoff, Elsa, Anna, Hans, and Olaf. And you can see that this trend tends to hold. We do see Hans having very rouged cheeks, and they're different than the way Kristoff's cheeks are red. Kristoff has the appearance of being like sunburnt or weathered, and Hans has the appearance of makeup. His lips are noticeably darker than Kristoff's, his eyebrows are more prominent, and he has green eyes. He also has a very similar color scheme to what Anna is wearing, but you can notice that there are hints of purple and black, the purple being slightly darker than what she's wearing on her cape here, and then black in his jacket and his boots. So it's not perfect. He also has these little gloves that are black as well, but we can see that his white outfit is accented with black, where Kristoff's black outfit is accented with white. We get the snow and the fur, so it's kind of visually identifying what Disney's going for here with, oh, you know, this is Hans, he's the guy for you, Anna, but then it's actually Kristoff and Hans is the villain. But looking specifically at the face, we do see those markers of makeup, and we also see the thinness, identifying him as potentially being disproportionate. Just looking at Kristoff's build, we can see that there is a difference. He looks more similar to Anna and Elsa than he does to Kristoff in terms of his body proportion, at least. So that's just one example. So here we can see three interpretations of the character of Gaston. The original style on the left is early concept art from around 1991. It's focused on the 1989 screenplay, and this is the original sort of idea of Gaston. He's a very effeminate man with his wig and rouge and makeup and his mole that he has there, and he clearly is more of a noble or a dandy, someone you might see in court. Given that this is provincial France, that has very specific sort of aristocratic implications. He has similar eyebrows to other Disney villains. They're very arched and thin. He does have the makeup, he has the eyes, and he also has an interesting body proportion. It looks like his shoulders are quite large, or else he's wearing a very ill-fitting jacket there. He's also extremely pale. Then, moving from that concept art, we can see in Beauty and the Beast, the 1991 version, that Gaston is completely different. His signature color is red. His skin tone matches those of the villagers. It's neither paler or more tan than theirs, which is something that you see still in Disney films, is that there's a variation in skin tone where perhaps the villain's not darker than the protagonist, but they are either paler or darker. So there is still a variation there. In this version, the 1991 one, we see Gaston is a handsome and masculine man. He doesn't wear makeup. He is the Pentagon of the village, their pinnacle man, you know, the manliest of all men in the entire village. He hunts and he's just super great. And there's even a song about how wonderfully perfect he is. Of course, this is not true, but he is very different from the version we see on the left, and he is described as being a very manly man. So he's the most normal of the villagers and all of the guys that we see in that village. We can see that his signature color is red. We can see that he has blue eyes. As an interesting side note, Gaston and Beast both have blue eyes, which is the first time one of the protagonists and the antagonist shared a physical characteristic in a Disney film. This also highlights the similarities between Gaston and Beast. So another interesting fact is that the Beast starts out wearing red in the beginning of the film. As time progresses and the Beast becomes more compassionate and aligns more with Belle's point of view, he begins to transition to wearing purple and then blue. So the way that red is used in this film is not the same as it is used in something like Aladdin, for example, where Jafar has the red and black outfit, which kind of identifies him as a villain. This is not specifically a villainous color. It is used to promote change and to show that growth of character more than anything in this particular film. And then on the right, we see Beauty and the Beast, the 2017 live-action version. And Gaston's very similar. There are some changes that have been made. Obviously, he's got the ruffle, which harkens more to the early concept art. But instead of being a hunter, like in the 1991 version, they have made him a soldier. So he has a little bit more of a uniform going on than just casual hunting wear. So who is Gaston? He's an 18th century Frenchman. He is a hunter or a soldier, depending on which interpretation of the film you're watching. These are both traditional protector occupations, and it is shown that he's a survivor. He has survived either animal attacks, like is indicated in the first one, or actual war, as is indicated in the live-action version. He is the suitor of Belle, the primary suitor, the only one that we really see. He's the prime specimen of man, and he's the leader of the mob against the Beast. So these are kind of the facts about Gaston that aren't disputed by the movie's coloring of him as a villain. So if we look at traditional Disney villain qualities, Gaston really doesn't meet that many. He could be said to embody the sin of pride and his vanity. However, there are several characters in Beauty and the Beast who can be said to embody pride, including our two main protagonists. His color scheme is bright and distinctive. It's not used in the same way as other villains' clothing, and even if red is a villain color, it wasn't one at the time. Gaston's shown to be visually distinct from other Disney villains. Even Hans from Frozen is more villainous looking or visually distinct than Gaston is, who looks very much like a typical villager. And he doesn't really have any of the other characteristics. He has a henchman in LeFou, or a sidekick, but he doesn't have explicitly evil motivations. He doesn't use the word fool in his vocabulary, though the Beast does. And he's not significantly older than the protagonist, and he's the most manly man in the village, so he's definitely not the other. He is the perfect epitome of a villager and does not really embody any of these characteristics. So Gaston's not a typical or traditional villain, especially up to the time period of 1991 when the character was created. I think we can all agree that he doesn't fit the model of villainry that Disney had to, at that point, create it. But so what, right? You may be looking at the screen and calling me crazy because obviously Gaston's the villain. I mean, he's the bad guy. But let's go through what he really did, his actual acts of villainry. So the really bad stuff that can't be excused or, talked about and changed in anything like that is that he conspired against Maurice to blackmail Belle. And in the 2017 version specifically, he tried to kill Maurice to blackmail Belle. He rallies the villagers and engages in fear-mongering. He sacrifices LeFou to the household implements, and he tries to kill Beast, in which he pleads for his life and then attacks him again. So he really is shown to be quite bloodthirsty in that regard. Now there's other stuff that he does because he's a jerk and he's not a nice character, but there's no law against being a jerk, not even in the social contract. So let's go through the not terrible villainry stuff, but still kind of a jerk stuff. He makes fun of her ability to read, and he says that women shouldn't read or think. He pursues Belle relentlessly only because of her looks. He expects her to stay home with her kids. He calls her prey in his attempts to woo her, throws her book in the mud, laughs about her crazy dad, plans a surprise wedding, and steps on her cabbages. My cabbages! But we can compare his list of truly villainous acts to that of Beast, who imprisoned Belle's sick father and originally imposed a death sentence on him. He wasn't going to let him out. He was going to keep him there until he died. And despite the fact that he was sick, he was not receiving proper medical treatment or any kind of treatment as far as I can tell. He then imprisoned and coerced Belle, not only to, spending time with him, but also eventually to falling in love with him, which a lot of people have called Stockholm Syndrome, and, they're not necessarily wrong. He also embodies a number of negative traits, from pride and selfishness to wrath, and his emotionally and verbally abusive outbursts. And he attacks the village incessantly, which I think is really interesting, an interesting addition in the 2017 version. But Beast is also a villain. If we look at the list of things, the really bad stuff for him, it's very similar to what we see for Gaston. So if Gaston's the villain, then Beast is the villain, at least in that sense. So it's important to distinguish between what we as the audience know and what Gaston, the character, knows. So here is the facts according to Gaston, and not colored by a sympathetic narrative like we see in the movie. Belle goes missing. Maurice claims that Belle has been kidnapped by a beast in a magic castle in the woods, and as far as the village knows, he's the last person to see her before she goes missing. He's shown crazy tendencies, especially in the 1991 version. Gaston doesn't find out about the Beast until Belle shows him the mirror much later in the film, and the Beast is a giant man-sized horned, sometimes fanged creature that kidnapped Belle. Belle shows the villagers the Beast in the mirror and says he's her friend, even though he kidnapped her and threatened her father. So these are the facts. So it's important to distinguish between what we as the audience know and what Gaston knows. So looking at things from his point of view, it takes a very different turn than the sympathetic narrative we've been told from the movie. And again, just to make the point that I'm not trying to excuse his actions or be an apologist for him, but is he the actual villain of this film? I don't think so. So this is taken in that kind of slightly academic context of trying to analyze this film and look at this from his point of view. You could almost compare it to A Handmaid's Tale, which is a version of propaganda and narrator bias that I think is really interesting. It's kind of similar to what we see here. And Disney has also played with this idea with movies like Maleficent, which switch the narrative and turn it about on its head. So I think it would be kind of interesting to see a Gaston movie where we see things from his point of view. But specifically, looking at his worst offenses, he conspires against Maurice to blackmail Belle and tries to kill Maurice to blackmail Belle in the 2017 version. So in the 1991 version, Maurice is ranting about a beast and Belle being captured. He's considered a loony old man, and Gaston conspires to use this to blackmail Belle into marriage. So he's using the situation to his advantage to try and tie her down, basically. This is bad. It's not bad, but it does have a direct parallel to her situation with Beast, and it's pretty much exactly the same as what Beast is trying to do with Belle, except he's trying to get her to fall in love with him before, the petals all fall to the ground and everything goes bad. In the 2017 version, Belle is missing. Maurice is the last person to see her. Maurice is ranting about a beast, and he's eccentric enough to be considered a harmless kook by the village. So when he tries to kill him, I think a couple of things are going on. We're seeing that Maurice has information and isn't giving it to him. Specifically, he's not telling him where this quote-unquote beast is. So for all Gaston knows, Belle is hurt or dying somewhere in the forest, and Maurice is withholding information. You can also consider that in this version he's a soldier, and so those protective instincts he has that are discussed throughout the film in various different ways, it could lead to him having PTSD. It's something I don't know enough about as, an armchair researcher to try and diagnose, but I do think that he has a lot of specific memories and things that he's trying to get away from. We see his personality change quite a bit when he has to engage in this sort of mean persona, I guess you could call it. And so I would be really interested in seeing someone who's far more qualified than I am talk about that point, because I do think there's something there. One of his other offenses is that he rallies the villagers in fear-mongering. This to me is not really something bad at all and shouldn't be considered one of his villainous characteristics. If we think about it from his perspective, he just found out a huge, terrifying, dangerous beast is real and very close to the village. He determines it's a threat and he needs to destroy it. So in the 2017 version, he's a soldier, and so he's trying to destroy this threat that threatens his hometown. But I think it's really interesting that in the 1991 version, he's a hunter. So of course he would try to find this beast and kill it. That's what he does, quite literally. And it's not quite as philosophical as the 2017 version with him having the career change. So next, his worst offense is sacrificing LeFou to the household implements. He leaves LeFou so that he can fight the beast before he succumbs to the household implements. So he basically leaves him to die. This could be, that he leaves him to die. It could be, you could make the claim that he, trusts him to pick himself back up and fight. It could also be that he recognizes the bigger threat. Really, it's just a jerk move. It's not a jerk move. There's no, excuse for it really or explanation. You could try to make the argument, but it's just a jerk move. That doesn't necessarily make him a villain, though. Not the overarching villain of this movie, at least. And then this last one is he tries to kill the beast, in which he pleads for him to spare his life and then attacks him again at the last moment. So Gaston attacks the Beast after he had already spared his life. He also finds out in this moment that the Beast is intelligent. And so it looks from our perspective in the audience like Gaston chooses to murder this sentient creature. But we do know also that Belle is having this moment with the Beast, and that's what sort of stays his hand. And if you're looking at it from Gaston's perspective, you see that Belle has been completely taken in and manipulated by this Beast. And so it's kind of understandable that he would attack him again, realizing that this threat might be even greater to his village. It's still a jerk move. It's not a jerk move, but it's certainly more understandable if you look at it from his perspective. So if Gaston's not a villain, what is he? Perhaps a traditional Prince Charming? No, I'm not making that argument. Just kidding. But there are some parallels between the traditional Prince Charming and Gaston, which are very, very interesting. Traditional Prince Charming, shown here as Prince Charming with Cinderella, is searching for love, often love at first sight. They're a perfect physical specimen and handsome. They're always popular, and they perfectly embody sameness and homogeny and fitting in with the crowd. They're courageous, hyper-masculine, they're the protector of the princess, and they're strong and have a willingness to fight. Usually in physical altercations and not intelligent strategy, they tend to be brawn over brains. And you can see that a lot of these tick the boxes for Gaston. Searching for love? Check. Perfect physical specimen? Check. Handsome? Check. Popular? Check. You get it. And so it is really, really interesting that he's supposedly the villain in this film when in any other movie he would marry the princess. And so I do think it's very, very interesting and not something that a ton of people talk about. So in this movie, we have a person who in any other movie would be a prince, and a Beast who in any other movie would be a villain. And this is because Gaston and Beast are foils. They're polar opposites, they're the inverse of each other. Beast is beautiful on the inside and ugly on the outside. Gaston is beautiful on the outside and ugly on the inside. In the original film in 1991, Gaston is a hunter, so they are diametrically opposed as a hunter and a large beast. The Beast is a noble who is isolated in his castle, where Gaston's just one of the guys, one of the villagers. Beast traps Belle, and Gaston's plans to coerce Belle into marrying him are very similar. They're slightly different circumstances, but they even have a similar way of thinking. So I find it really, really interesting that there are so many similarities between the Beast and Gaston if Gaston's supposed to be the villain and the Beast is our Prince Charming. This might be easier to swallow in a Batman film where you're talking about Batman and Harvey Dent or Batman and the Joker, but this isn't that type of film. So I think it's an interesting stretch for Disney to continue selling the idea that Gaston is the villain. So now we get to some interesting side notes. These don't really offer that much, it's just contextual, but when you love the movie as much as I do, I find it just really fascinating. This film is perhaps the gayest Disney film ever created. It has the least other-coded antagonist or villain who's just a normal person. Howard Ashman, one of the creators, wrote it as an allegory for AIDS and the AIDS crisis that was happening in, the late 80s, early 90s. Beast's focus as a main character and his isolation, the curse that overtakes his life, and how it affects others around him is a direct parallel to the stories of people that he was hearing at the time and experiencing at the time. Some other interesting information: first wave princesses are passive heroines. That would be someone like your Snow White. She doesn't really do anything, she doesn't have any agency, things just happen to her. Second wave princesses have more agency. So we see that Belle is a second wave princess. She's slightly more the master of her own destiny, but as a second wave princess, she still succumbs to the idea that a heteronormative life is the perfect one and she needs to marry the prince and live her happily ever after. There is no other perfect happy ever after ending. And then another interesting point is that only Belle can get away with flouting the norm. Because of her beauty and her femininity, she can escape her traditional life. So she doesn't really have agency in her choices. Had she been anyone else, that might not have worked, or, did anything differently to not subscribe to the same traditional Disney formula, it wouldn't have been the same if she wasn't as beautiful and this paragon of intelligence and femininity who's a perfect princess in everything but name. We also see that Belle rejects Gaston and chooses the Beast, but her ending is still the same. You marry the prince, you have your happy ending. The only thing flipped in this film is that Beast is the groom, not Gaston. So this is highlighting that though women have more agency and freedom of choice, they still aspire or should aspire to a traditional heteronormative marriage to the prince and the embodiment of the perfect princess. So I think it's really interesting that this movie in a lot of ways has nothing to do with Belle and is about the Beast. And they slowly have this relationship that grows and they change and transform together, but Belle just substitutes one groom for another. She doesn't really have a lot of growth that she does by the end of the film, whereas we see a ton of growth on Beast's side. Quite literal physical transformation. We also see that the homogenous villagers provide Belle an opportunity to distinguish herself as different, but this difference is portrayed as something to overcome, shown in her later acceptance of the village through her marriage into power. So when we're talking about the other as a concept of Disney villainry, it's always an obstacle. It's something different, it's something that isn't helpful, it's a hindrance, and we see the same thing for Belle, but instead of, embracing that difference, kind of like we see Elsa do in Frozen, she just finds a different community. And in the end, that community merges with her original community, so she doesn't really learn anything. And this kind of just shows that even though Disney was playing around with feminism and improving their heroines to not quite be as passive as like Snow White, literally getting kissed by someone when she's unconscious, it's really still subscribing to those same ideals that they're trying to perpetuate for their audiences. The Enchantress is the true villain of this film. She is coded as the villain. She is visually distinct. She's similar to the old witch in Snow White, significantly older than our protagonists, and far more powerful. She wants power, or to exert her power over people, and she embodies the sins of pride and wrath, possibly envy. Her motivations for cursing the young prince are never quite made clear, though envy could certainly be one of them. So something I think is interesting and hopefully can underscore my point. This here is again that slide from earlier, and you can see just the visual differences between our characters and the Enchantress. Even in her beautiful form, she's completely dressed in green, which is very different from the shades we see in the Villagers and Maurice. A different animation style in the 1991 version, and she has these exaggerated features. We even see a super tiny waist and a big hoop skirt, and then the crone has this huge sort of hunchback. They're very, very specifically done. We also know that green is a villain color, and she embodies quite a bit of it. If we look at the 2017 version, we can see that her color scheme is all black, right? Here she's kind of composed of light and magic. It's not green or black, I'll give you that, but it is different for sure. And she's definitely visually distinct from any other character in this entire film. And even when we look at Agatha, we can see that she's different. Here are the villagers, you know, the quote-unquote normal folk. She's very different from them as well. And so she is visually distinct. She has specific aims of power. She embodies the 7 deadly sins of pride, at least. And she enchants this castle and all of the people in it, both in the 1991 version and the 2017 version. But in the 2017 version, she also enchants the village. So she really is placing this curse on a lot more people than just the prince she supposedly was cursing in the first place. So she's very, very powerful. And I think it's super interesting that literally none of the movie could have happened without her in both instances. But the second one in particular is directly caused through her enchantment. So she's coded as the villain. She's distinct. She embodies the sins of pride and wrath, much more present in the 2017 version, and her curse extends to the village beyond the castle. But her evil actions start the entire film. So I don't know how you term her actions as not evil, especially when you consider that the villagers are innocent. Even in the 1991 version, I mean, you could say that the servants are culpable in some way if you really want to stretch that argument, but just in terms of power and authority, they're not really responsible for what the noble owner of the house does, even if he's 10 or 12. So I think that's kind of a flimsy argument, but if you have ones for why her actions aren't evil, I'd love to hear them. But without those evil actions, nothing happens. There is no movie, there is no plot. And in this movie, what we've seen, or in the series, I guess you could call it, nothing is what it seems. Villain characteristics, one could even argue that Belle adheres to quite a few of them. And she's visually distinct. She embodies the sins of pride and envy with her song, which is so rude, about wanting more than this provincial life, etc. So I think it's an interesting take on Beauty and the Beast, and one that I've gotten quite a bit of flack for, but to me, the villain is and always will be the Enchantress. So, final conclusions, final thoughts. To call Gaston a villain is to call every Disney prince a villain, and to take a dark look at the chauvinism and misogyny inherent in Disney's heteronormative structure. Because even when the princesses have apparent agency, they really don't. They get married to the prince and live happily ever after. Gaston is the antagonist and the foil to the Beast, and really all he had to do to win her over was lock her in his house until she fell in love with him. And her willingness to see the Beast as something more is really the only difference. She's kind of shallow. All it took for her love was really just to give her a library. So the true villain is the power-hungry maniac who set this whole time loop into place. Agatha, you know what you did. So thanks for listening to my presentation. I appreciate it. I would love to hear any and all thoughts. My email is snailmelexpress@gmail.com. And if you agree, disagree, let me know. I'm always down to talk about Gaston discourse. I hope you guys are staying safe and have a fantastic day.